prospect of a very warm and exciting and provocative talk by one of the most provocative public intellectuals. Over to you, Dipankar.
And thank you all for coming. I am not quite sure what I should do, but maybe I'll keep this paper in reserve just in case something goes wrong, terribly wrong. The idea of this paper came from looking at the world around us, and I felt that there was a great tectonic shift in the way politics was being conducted in this country. And around the time I got a little overwhelmed by my own patriotic consciousness, I realized similar things were happening elsewhere in the world as well. So the good thing is that we are part of the globe. And what's happening in India is not quite as different as or as peculiar as we make it out to be, but there is a resonance of this sort elsewhere in this world. Sociology has always prided itself in engaging with events. And that has been our hallmark in sociology. And I think that's true of all social sciences. And I say sociology simply because I come from that discipline, but it does not absolve other disciplines of this responsibility. And I must say they've all conducted themselves fairly on this count. When we were not independent, but a colony, most sociologists were concerned about explaining to the world and to themselves more than anybody else who we Indians are. And in that quest, they talked about our civilizational glory, our past, our traditions, so that we should feel quite proud of ourselves and not be run down by the colonial attitude towards Indians. And that did a fair job, I think. Some of the early sociologists really were quite remarkable in pulling out traditions quite effectively and nuancing them so that we understood comprehensively who we were, and we had no reason to feel ashamed of ourselves. Now, once we became independent, that element went out of the window because we didn't have to talk about that anymore. We are a confident nation. We are people who are now in charge of a sovereign state. And so the next question was, well, what are we all about? How do we relate to one another? What is our social structure going to be like, what it is now and what will it be like? What kind of modifications should we entertain in our society to take it forward, to make it a more liberal, democratic society which is tuned to the needs of citizens? And that led us to study villages, caste relations, kinship, industrial relations, and so forth. And so there was a kind of fine slicing of the social world we live in so that we got a better understanding of who we are as Indians. But then, at the same time, we realized that in spite of the fact that we are all Indians, we come from different backgrounds and have different obsessions, different concerns, different interests. And so, we have to recombine all of that to make sense of our society and also to think of ways and means by which we could take our society forward in the direction, obviously, of greater participation, greater democracy, and yes, development too. So what happened in the 50s and 60s was, in our country and elsewhere in the world as well, but more strikingly in our country, is the advance of industrialization and at the same time the awareness of who we are culturally. These two aspects were going hand in hand. And if you were to believe some of the political scientists of that era, and some sociologists too, you can throw them in the basket as well, the point that was being made is that, look, this is a kind of cleavage politics at work. There's so many cleavages in society. And what we're really doing is we are flogging the cleavage. Each one has got his or her own territory, each political party. And they're using that to leverage themselves to power. And so cleavage is all about politics, or politics is all about cleavages. It's all about territory, holding on to territory. So if it was industrialization, the differences that were posited in industrialization was core versus periphery, rural versus urban, or some of you might even have heard of this very fetching distinction between Bharat and India. So these were the sort of fallouts of industrialization. But keeping in mind the stress on who we are kind of scholarship, we also looked at culture, and we found caste, religion, language. And here again, we found that caste, religion, and language didn't just stay there on the cultural realm, but they actually interfered very solidly in everyday life, particularly in the economic sphere. So whether you're talking industrialization, or you're talking culture, whether you're talking about the various aspects of industrialization, such as core, periphery, village, rural, urban, or culture like caste, religion, language, at the end of the day, the emphasis, at least in the political expression of these phenomena, was economic in character. In other words, I would like to use the word producerist in character. You might even go further and say factor producerist in character, factor in the sense of land, labor, capital, etc., in character. So caste was not left at caste, nor was religion just religion, nor was language just language. Each of these were given a factor producerist quality. So you had, if you were looking at caste, you saw caste in terms of, landlords and peasants and sharecroppers and things like that. Or if you were thinking of religion, you saw things in terms of the oppressed religion and the oppressing religion. Language in the entire struggle in the State Reorganization Commission regarding state reorganization, let us say Maharashtra or Samyukta Maharashtra Samiti, there the emphasis was how Maharashtrians were being done in by the non-Maharashtrians in the province of Bombay and what they should do to reclaim their territory to themselves. You saw bits and pieces of that in the Shiv Sena movement as well, and the emergence of nativist-like mobilizations in different parts of the country. So the cultural factor, as much as those factors that were released by industrialization, both these factors, when they were given a political expression, the political expression was primarily in terms of factor producerist logic, that these are issues that have economic origin, economic logic, and unless we understand those, we can't really pursue them with any degree of efficacy. So the politics of cleavage, or which what was his name? Lipset made popular, that politics of cleavage really was quite effective for a very long time. And now I think, as we engage with events, I think the world is changing under our very nose, and we have to take cognizance of it, as good old-fashioned sociologists always do. And that is that this kind of mobilization of cleavage politics, where factor producerism plays a very important role, that is receding. It is not any longer as attractive as it used to be. Just ask yourself, when political parties today organize around economic issues like FDI or whatever, you don't really get that kind of enthusiasm on the streets as you would do when you're fighting against corruption or against security or gender harassment. That brings out a lot of enthusiasm amongst people like us, almost everybody. Now, why is this so? I think in some measure, and I'll proceed on this gently, step by step, but in some measure I think we should first and foremost acknowledge that the fear of the great evil, or greater evil, or the greatest evil is dead. We don't think in those terms anymore. There was a time when capitalism versus communism was the biggest thing, biggest going, and then you had Eisenhower and the domino theory. In countries like ours, you even thought in terms of partition and the evil of partition, what partition did to you. So there are fears everywhere. If, as you might remember, when the Samyukta Maharashtra Samiti came up in the 50s and they wanted a separate state of Maharashtra, the fear then was that, well, these people want Maharashtra today, and tomorrow they'll probably unfurl a flag and say Maharashtra is a sovereign state. And that might happen. That was a great fear. But today, when you have Chhattisgarh or Uttarakhand or whatever, Jharkhand, nobody really worries that much. Nobody says that this is the beginning of another round of secession and partition. Those kinds of fears are gone. They don't really, actually worry us that much. Nor is the capitalism versus communism fear that, compelling any longer. In my view, for 50 years, from the mid-50s onwards, a little over 45 years, I think democracy took a real beating because the world was divided into capitalists and communists. It didn't really matter how good you were or how bad you were as long as you were on my side. So you could be a certified killer, but a good old-fashioned capitalist, and therefore you are a good person. You are a good guy. You're a Democrat. On the other hand, you could be a mass murderer, but because you believe in Marxism, Leninism, Maoism, or whatever, you are one of us, and all your sins are forgiven. So in this tussle between capitalism and communism, democracy is what took a beating. Democracy lost out. Nobody talked about democracy anymore. And when I think back again, I find that from the 50s onwards, democracy has not really made huge strides either. It has inched its way up, bits and pieces. In many cases, democracy has achieved, after a great time lag, what some other democracies already achieved in the 40s. But if you were to talk about history of democracy, regardless of country, place, context, and time, you would find that this period, the Cold War, was really very bad for democracy in general. It didn't really do much. We fought against the other, was pitted not as a democratic opponent, but as an economic opponent. It was a factor producerist logic at work. And the dominant theory was also an example of that. So you have, on the one hand, this kind of communism versus capitalism. On the cultural front, you have another cleavage, which is clash of civilizations, for example. There's a big cleavage out there. One kind of civilization versus another kind of civilization. And in places like India, as I told you a little while back, the fear was that if something goes wrong, there'll be another partition. That was a great fear. There was constant undertow, All this is very good. But what will happen tomorrow? We weren't very sure of ourselves. Though we were, I think, quite a confident nation state when it started out, though there was no reason to worry that we would come apart. Of course, there was this big schism at the time of our birth. And yet, this fear of the greater evil, this fear of partition, actually allowed a lot of non-democratic sentiments to go around, and I think to a large extent underplayed the demands of citizenship, at least to the extent that I think it should be played out. Now what's happening is this, that from Tunisia to Egypt to Brazil, India, Philippines, everywhere, you find a new kind of upsurge happening. You might want to describe it or analyze it in any old way you like to, but the fact is that this new upsurge is not consciously in any fashion factor producerist in character. In fact, this new kind of movement that we see around us is aimed rather against the government, asking the government to deliver. The government is not delivering, the government should deliver. Deliver to whom? Deliver to citizens. The demand of citizenship is uppermost. And if you ask the question, what do you mean by citizenship? It eventually boils down to things like health, education, security, and the rest of it. Such that the kind of ideologies you see today in the forefront in all these movements is really quite, skimpy, and you might even say emaciated. It doesn't have a full-bodied, flavor about it. It's not like the capitalism, communism, clash of civilization kind of ideology. What's going on now? We are the indignados, or we are the 99%, or we are the Aam Aadmi, or I am Anna, graffiti-like slogans really. But there you are, and these seem to excite people. I'm sure they wouldn't have, moved anybody 40 years back, but today they seem so charming, so wonderful, so full of promise. And the old ghosts that were so fearful face up, you flip them over, they're equally awesome the other way around. No longer. We don't really get worked about capitalism or communism or anything of the kind. Clash of civilization was so important because if you allowed those Arabs on horseback or on tanks to come into your civilized territory, it'd be all over for you. So prop up certain states like Israel that can cure everything from an oil shock to a snake bite. Just hang on to them. Now, these were the kinds of ideologies that people had in the past. And they would wear them, very obviously, and most of us fell for it. But today, that doesn't seem to be persuasive at all. I mean, anyone who says that seems like yesterday's ghost, not even yesterday's person. And that is why these other slogans, which are so simplistic in nature, have somehow caught our imagination. And I often wonder why this happened and how it happened. It's quite possible, again, that someone may do a deep class analysis of it, and I think they might succeed in their endeavor. But the fact is that most people who are on the streets out there doing things are not thinking in factor producerist terms, not thinking me as a class of laborer against capitalist or as a class of peasants against landlord. These issues are not important anymore in the same old way. You think of the number of strikes, industrial strikes in our country. From over 3,000 strikes in 1990, last year there were barely 312 strikes. So industrial strikes have also gone down. Yes, there are reasons for it. We can come to those reasons, but strikes as a phenomenon is not quite as full of promise and doesn't have its batteries charged up around the clock. There are problems with it. You look at the farmers' movement, for example. Again, you don't have landlord versus peasant movements any longer. At best, you have farmers getting together, fighting against the state. But that too is not doing very well these days. Even that is sort of losing ground quite rapidly. So what do we see around us? We see that someone like Mulayam Singh Yadav is promising tablets, computer tablets, and not caste reservation. You have Modi talking development and not Hindutva in the same way. You have the Akali Dal who once did nothing but panthik politics, or the Panth. Today they are into the Citizen Charter, and they're putting a lot of emphasis on Citizens Charter and how to make governance easier and better perhaps in Punjab. Of course, they can't really swing it all the way because there are many corrupt people en route. But nevertheless, this is what they're trying to tell the voters and get them along on their side. So these are some of the efforts that are going on. Now, if you were to ask me, why is this change taking place? What is the big thing that's happened that has moved people from factor producerist kinds of mentality to this other thing where they want things from the government, which I think is a kind of civic consumerism, not consumerism in the old-fashioned way, but consumerism of citizens that demand civic services from the government, then I really think that the answer probably lies in the levels of urbanization in our society. You look at, say, Brazil, from 46% 50 years back, today Brazil's urban population is about 85%. Tunisia, from 33% is about 65% again in Tunisia, about 30% jump. 30% jump in that too, there again, in Egypt. Brazil, I'm sorry. In Cairo, a quarter of Egypt's population is in Cairo. A third of Thailand's population is in Bangkok. There are huge urban developments that have taken place in the past so many years. And the Indian story is also quite remarkable. In India, we somehow tend to underplay the role of urbanization in India simply because we have not made up our minds what it is that makes a particular place urban. We're not very sure about that. Of course, there are certain features, phenomena that they listed out officially. But if you just take one of them, which is 75% of adult males should be working in non-agricultural occupations, then you will find that almost all villages today are not agricultural, not rural. You'll rarely find a village today where 75% of the working male population is engaged in agriculture. It's not there. And if you were to look at it even more closely, you'll find that there are large numbers of people who live in the village but don't work in the village either. So very often the census guys come around and they make a mess of things because they don't pay attention to these fine details. And I can say this with some degree of confidence because I did a double check on some of the villages that the census had recorded in the district census handbook. And I went through the same terrain myself, and I found a huge discrepancy. It wasn't just 5% or 6% or 10%, it was 35, 40% discrepancy. And I realized that there is a problem in the way in which we look at census. The National Sample Survey, the way it defines farmers, is so generous. Everybody is a farmer, really. It says that anybody who tills land, his land, her land, somebody else's land, is a farmer. And it says if you do this during the past 365 days, which means that if you do it for 10 days, 15 days, 20 days, 1 month, 2 months, you're a farmer. And a farmer's household is any such household which has one such person. So you may have a doctor, a lawyer, an engineer, and a person who tills land for 2 months in a year. That becomes a farmer's household. So this is how the understanding of rural India, I think, has suffered a great deal. If you also now look at the migration that takes place, you'll find that people often households migrate from one village to another village. And when this happens, believe me, it's not marriage or culture or whatever. People are really looking for jobs. So search for jobs in migration, of course, we know, but what we also need to know now is a large number of people are moving from village to village in search of jobs, and those jobs are not agricultural. In the census, there's a category called buildings and the uses to which they are put. If you look at this category carefully, you'll find, of course, the buildings used as dwelling, as schools, as temples, as hospitals, but the bulk of them are for workshops, worksheds. In rural India, the bulk of these buildings are used as workshops, worksheds. So economic activity, which is not agricultural in character, is taking place in so many of these villages, which is why the last count was done in 1996, but another one is about to happen any day. The National Account Statistics says that 45.5% of rural net domestic product, rural by the way, net domestic product, is not agricultural. In other words, almost half the village economy today is not agricultural. This is a 1996 figure. I'm sure if you were to do it today, it'll be a lot more. So the village itself is very, very different. You know, the old village that we had talked about, where you had big landlords who in the 1960s controlled almost a third of agricultural land, today controls only a tenth. Look at the big difference. 85% of rural holdings are below 2 hectares. Now, nobody can really make a future, cantilever that dream on agriculture anymore. It has to be something else. So if you are someone like Mahendra Singh Tikayat, who was the leader of the Bharatiya Kisan Union, and whom most of us said was a rich kulak, we have to now think again. Because he only had 15 acres of land, he had 3 children who had married. So what does it leave you with? 5 acres per person, per family. So the subdivision of land has done what the land reform couldn't do. In other words, there isn't that kind of landlord presence in rural India anymore. But what is more interesting is, forget landlord, forget everything else, the extent of non-agricultural occupation in rural India is really impressive. If you were to look at units that employ less than 10 people in non-agricultural occupations in rural India, that number has gone up in 1996 and 2008 by 110%. You know, that's the kind of spurt that is taking place in rural India. So, when I say urbanization, I want you to be a little more generous in your understanding of urbanization. I think first and foremost you must realize urbanization is not simply about moving to places with their chimney stacks and slums, but you can have urban-like phenomena in small towns, in some villages too, and of course in big cities, which is why, probably, for the first time in the 2011 census, we see a remarkable feature. That is, urban population in pure numbers, the growth in urban population, pure numbers, beats rural population growth in pure numbers by a whisker, but it breasts the tape before the rural population increase. Urban population increased by 91 million and rural population increased by 90.7 million. But the interesting thing is, urban India is growing faster in number terms than rural India is. In percentage terms, urban India has grown by 31% and rural India only by 13%. In terms of million plus cities, the last 10 years, 18 new million plus cities, 72 new class 1 towns, and God knows 2,770 something new census towns. That's what's happening today. When I began studying rural India, I thought it was, I'd made a huge discovery like Columbus or something, that there's so many people in rural India who don't work on land. You know, I made a big to-do out of that. But then I realized very soon that I wasn't paying attention to what was happening under my nose. Urban India was changing very, very remarkably and very dramatically rather, and I wasn't looking at it closely enough. And when I looked at it closely, I found that what was happening in rural India and urban India were of a piece. They were not happening separately. They were happening together. And therefore, those fetching distinctions between Bharat and India, I think, are completely besides the point. The two are really in a kind of in a lockstep. They're dancing together. And this is something that we have to pay attention to. That is why I feel that the whole world has changed to a great extent, at least politically. You know, as long as the old world was there, I think the politics of meeting felt needs was quite attractive, which is why factor producerist ideas ruled the day, as long as you met felt needs. So we lived in villages, nothing changed very much, and it's all right, our expectations were low, and things were sought. Now that we are no longer sure or certain about the future, now that we know that this village will not help anymore, now that we know that landlords are gone and I just have a small piece of land, handkerchief-sized plot I must hang on to, I have to send 2.5 children in my family outside to look for a job. Absolutely essential. Whether they find a job in a carpet industry in the village or in some other place in the city, weaving garments or stitching garments and weaving linen, they have to go out. This is something that I've realized now. I can't help it. Therefore, as a parent, I would like my children to leave me and go away. And if you see the kind of migration that happens in rural India, you'll be really surprised that these people are taking such enormous risks that you and I would not take. There is a network, of course, which is in place. But just imagine somebody in faraway Jharkhand buying a train ticket because somebody out there in Tirupur tells him there's a job waiting here, you might give it a shot. And this person takes a train and lands up there, and maybe the job is there, maybe it's not there, but there's some promise of a job, and they go. Now this is the kind of risk that they're willing to take. Why? If you look at the manpower statistics of India, it's so interesting that 56% of those, a little over 56, almost 57% of those who are listed as unskilled laborers in our country, 56% of those, 56 point something or the other, of those are actually have a school degree. They're not illiterate people. 17% of those actually have a college degree. They're graduates. And they work in the as unskilled laborers. So now what do you have? If you're talking about felt needs, it's not going to do. It's not going to work. You have to address aspirations of people. The felt aspirations of people. That is very important. Felt needs was very good as long as the factor producers thing was at work. But now that all of that has gone, what really energizes people is the question of aspirations. Which is why today so many villagers are sending their children to private schools because of aspirations. They want their children to be educated. And because they also know that government schools don't really deliver the way they should, even though so many of us believe the government schools are what we should continue to sponsor and support. In principle, I agree, but the fact of the matter is that in 1980, only 2% of Indian kids went to a private school. And today, 21% in rural India and 51% in urban India go to private schools. And these private schools aren't the spiffy kind that you and I probably know of, but they're very, very humble affairs. There's probably one room which is maybe smaller than this, with 3 sections or whatever. The teachers in most of these private schools get below minimum wages. They get wages less than a laborer might get. And yet, these kids go to private school. If you go to a village around 2:33 in the afternoon, a scooter rickshaw will emerge, 2 or 3 of them will emerge, and quite magically from the scooter rickshaw, about 13 children will be disgorged, and these children are all coming back from a private school with skinny legs, dragging their satchels with string tie. Parents can hardly afford to send those children to these schools, and yet they send them there in the hope that these children will learn something, and tomorrow they won't be here like we are stuck. They'll be somewhere else, perhaps in a slum, in a city, but doing a job of work so that they'll have some change in their pockets. Now, this is the kind of aspiration that people have. I've come across many carpet weavers who say our parents taught us to weave carpets, but we won't teach our children to weave carpets because look where it has left us. In this dank, dark, deep hole. We don't want our kids to be here. So the kids are not doing anything very smart or, engaging themselves in something productive. They're not learning maths, English, whatever. They're kicking can and whistling around the village, but they will not weave carpets. They're waiting for some signal somewhere, across the mud walls that will take them away from the village. This is their real dream. Now, if you were a person with a degree which cost your parents maybe 1 lakh or 2 lakh, your piece of paper, but you don't have a job, you don't have a network, you don't have connections, and you know enough English to know that you do not know English, then what is your future? That is the big problem. That is what we're facing today. Second, what we also realize is that no matter where you are from or what your background is, there are certain things that must come to your doorstep because you're a citizen of the country. This demand of citizenship is really much, much more strident than it ever was in the recent past. Today, the past 4 or 5 years, I think all of this is creating a din in our heads, and we have to recognize it. What we now recognize is that because of urbanization, the old system where you were what you were because of your birth, your background, your location, the little mohalla where you lived, the street you lived, the gully you lived, that does not really make much sense anymore. Mickey Marriott, way back in the 60s, had talked of this distinction between interaction versus attribution. And he said that in rural India, it's more about interaction, who you are, where you come from, and that's how you are located, and that's how you are defined. Whereas in urban India, it's all about attributes. That is, what do you wear? Do you have a transistor? Do you have a black and white television? Do you have a mobile phone? Do you wear a white shirt, clean clothes, ride a motorcycle? Attribution is what counts. I think today we might say quite safely that the world of interaction is dead or dying. The world of attributes is alive but not doing well. But it is alive, it's kicking, but not doing that well. But it is going in that, we're going in that direction. When you talk in terms of attributes, you're obviously talking now in terms of aspirations, what people want. And one of the aspirations I mentioned to you was about education. The second aspiration, big one, is about health. Health, education. Third one is about safety. Now just imagine you have so many people coming to cities, and there is this question of safety. What will happen to the girls? What will happen to the women in the house? What will happen to anybody? That safety becomes a major concern. And this was not a concern in the past when things were more or less bottled up and when we knew that tomorrow will be the same as today. But when the world is changing around us, we can't be that sure anymore. So while you have urbanization on the one hand, at the same time, you don't have the kind of civic facilities that should accompany urbanization. It is this lack of civic facilities that should accompany urbanization is what really galls us. That's what really bothers us a great deal. And we may or may not theorize upon it, we may not even intellectualize upon it, but I think in the last resort, this is where the rub lies, that we do not feel satisfied that our citizenship urges are being met. And that is what brings people out on the streets with slogans that I told you earlier that are so skimpy, almost graffiti-like. So now you take this whole world of contemporary economic development in our country and in other countries somewhat like ours, you'll find that the demand for getting skilled job, the demand for being technically qualified, all of these things are not being satisfied. In our country, for example, research and development is not taking place really in industry, which is why 93% of our labor force is still in the informal sector. When 93% labor force is informal sector, and then you have the breakdown of agriculture, the way I'm talking, where we now understand it to be, then obviously you're going to have a whole lot of aspirations which you have not been able to meet. Now, what do you do about that? In my view, therefore, to conclude, I think that if we are seeing a different kind of mobilization of streets, if we see the old political mobilizations today appearing stagey, hysterical, even histrionic, and these ones seem very authentic and genuine, it's simply because we have moved some distance now. Now we demand things from the government, from the state, to deliver to us as citizens, and you can't frighten us anymore by making faces at us with all those old ghosts. Those things don't work that well. Now there are new problems, new issues, and these new problems and new issues have to be addressed. We have so far ducked this responsibility. Maybe we'll be successful a few more years, but in times to come, I'm sure we'll have to face it front up. Thank you.